Morning, everyone. ThinkTech
Good
Hawaii.
morning.
Hey, rule of law in the new abnormal. Hey, and today we're caught in between the Scylla and Charybdis of Asian American Pacific Islander hate speech and crimes and the George Floyd murder trial. So,
And voting rights.
and voting rights, which go to all of those. So the needle keeps swinging back and forth in many directions. We have with us Professor Vernellia Randall, University of Dayton School of Law, and one of the leading experts on race and the law anywhere. Ben Davis from the University of Toledo School of Law and soon to be Washington and Lee College of Law. And Jim Alfini, former Dean of Northern Illinois College of Law and of South Texas College of Law and professor as well. So we have an preeminent group here, folks. There's a lot on the table. Voting rights, Derek Chauvin, George Floyd trial, Asian American crimes and reaction, hate crimes and reaction. Where would you like to start?
Well, I'd like to start with the violence against Asian Americans. A lot of the stuff that I read, I think is starting to change. But initially, people wanted to articulate a story as if the hate crimes are against Asian Americans is so unusual and so unexpected. When there's been a long standing history of hate against all different aspects of a uh, Asian American group, and so they're the only group that a lawless pastors specifically named them the Chinese Americans. Chinese not being able to immigrate to the United States, the Japanese Americans, the only group to be interned in a concentration camp. And there's been just violence and hate. The thing I think people find is that anti-Asian violence sort of has an ebb and flow to it, that it's always, there's always a minimum level that's always there. But then when something happens, it spikes up real high and people notice it. But the violence against Asian Americans is predictable, unfortunately.
Cornelia, do you think that the notion that the pandemic was caused by a Chinese factor, if you will, has stoked those fires? I mean, is that the catalytic agent for the most recent?
I think so.
Yeah.
I mean, a
And
need to, well, first of all, we as Americans have the need to blame somebody for whatever's happening to us as a country. And if we can blame an outside group, and then, yes, that focus on that, well, that in the Trump administration has been stroking the anti-Asian hate, not just around the pandemic, but just generally sort of stroking that hate. And so with his behavior and the pandemic, you have a large segment of people who are racist already, who have stereotypes and prejudice that pre-existing, and they're happy to transfer their anger onto to Asian Americans and people who, and not just Asian Americans, people who they presume to be Asian Americans. So it's not the violence, and it's always been like that. I don't want to make this a different, but no, I agree with you that I
Yeah,
think that stroked it.
yeah. If I can jump in, if you go back to the recession of 1982, and when Japan was eating the lunch of Detroit's automakers, Then you had the murder of Vincent Chin, and just a couple guys got into their minds that they were going to just beat up this guy because they thought he was Japanese. I think Vincent Chin wasn't. He was Chinese, but he's Asian looking. That kind of thing. The other one I saw recently, which kind of got to me, was back when he was president. Teddy Roosevelt contacted the San Francisco mayor to tell the San Francisco mayor to calm down the attacks on Japanese Americans there in San Francisco. So there were lynchings and things like that because it was causing him a problem with the Japanese government, with what was happening to the Japanese who had emigrated to the States at that time. And another thing I think of is, the famous Versailles Treaty. At that meeting, the Japanese delegation wanted a plank in there about stopping racial discrimination, and the Western powers basically laughed at him and humiliated him. And as part of that reaction, the Japanese, with the military side, started to build on that led us to what we had in World War II and all that with the Japanese. So a lot of heavy history. You can go back even. There's a classic case that people in law school learn called Alaska Packers versus Domenico. In contrast, it's about these ships that used to go up from San Francisco to Alaska and can tuna and canned salmon up there. Well, there's actually a movie on YouTube all about that time, and one of the things that really struck me was that the cooks on those ships were Chinese. Okay, a lot of the Chinese immigrants who were there, and there were rules. There were rules that if the ship was going down because of some storm, they're supposed to lock the Chinese in the kitchen. Okay, I mean, I'm telling you how deep this stuff is. Then there's the old thing about building the railroads, and the Chinese workers were basically put in the position where they were to put the dynamite to blow up the way for the railroad, and the fuses were very unsteady in terms of their consistency, and so you might have a fuse go off suddenly, and that was where I think the phrase you don't have a Chinaman's chance, because there was the kind of high risk spot that they were in terms of being exploited, so the saddest thing is I saw a video here in Ohio of an Asian American man who basically said, "What, you want to know about patriotism?" He was in a meeting, like a city council meeting. He's one of the 5 members of the city council. He took off his shirt and he rolled up his T-shirt, and underneath were the wounds he'd suffered as a soldier in the U.S. Army. And he looked at everybody there and said, "Is that patriotic enough for you? Is that patriotic enough for you?" The fact that a guy would feel he needed to do that and would do that was, it's like a 69-year-old man doing that, and it was really moving.
Part of the problem, I think, in terms of why we keep having so much hate-motivated crimes is because our law is so narrowly drawn, especially federal law and most state laws. And so in federal law, for instance, you can't, a hate crime, you have to prove that but for the prejudice or the stereotype that the person who committed the crime would not have committed the crime. That's an almost impossible standard to meet.
Yeah.
And it's a deliberate standard. I was thinking about this today. When we think about the law, we can think about who does the law want to protect and who does it want to just pretend like it's protecting. And oftentimes the law, even when it's supposed to be doing something for a disenfranchised, marginalized group, you name the group, it'll take a tactic that on its face seems like that's what it's going to do, but it's so narrow that what it does, in fact, is allow a lot of things that would be covered to go uncovered. There's no reason why we shouldn't have a negligence standard in hate crimes. You
Yep.
know, you knew or should have known that this would have been perceived as a hate crime, and that consequently, you knew or should have known that this was going to be tied to a prejudice and stereotype and bias, and consequently have negligent hate crimes, have negligent discrimination. But we don't do that in the area of discrimination, largely because the law is designed to protect white people from being unjustly accused of discrimination, which isn't, it's a fair goal. It just means that if you're going to overprotect white people in the area of discrimination, you're going to underprotect the group that you're trying to hit at. Because as a public health nurse, you either going to be over inclusive or under inclusive. You're not going to hit the mark. So you
Right.
have to make a decision. And we have made a decision to underprotect not just racial minorities, but other groups as well. And we don't even protect people with class. Let's not even go down that road, because class has no protection in our law, basically, as far as I understand.
Yeah. I would, if I could jump in one more time. I, there's this whole distinction between intent and disparate impact in our law, with a very narrow disparate impact, and I think a very narrow intent. And in international law, they talk about purpose and effect, which are both broader than in U.S. law. So the effect is that space between purpose and effect, and intent and disparate impact in domestic law is that space where a lot of abuse can happen to people, that I think is tragic. And I'm not saying international law is perfect, but I just know it's got a bigger vision of what are the kind of things that amount to racial discrimination, or a discrimination against women and things like that, by having that broader view. The other thing I wanted to say is, when I saw that guy take up his 69-year-old man take up his T-shirt there, there's a part of me that kind of cried that he would have to stand in a meeting in 2021 having somebody question his patriotism. And when I saw that old black man crying on the stand in the George Floyd murder trial, I felt this old pain. Not just George Floyd and crying for him, but crying for so many in a way that was just, so deep. It reminded me of the feeling I had when I was watching all those people outside of the civic center when Katrina was going on, and they were just suffering, just like that same kind of old, like an old wound being rubbed, that has always been there, and it just gets reignited every once in a while. And I really don't know what has to be done to have that sense of moral, or that sense of terrible sadness of unfairness be reflected in the law, so that these kinds of things don't happen, or in the way that police are trained, or in the way that people are trained in their families about what you're supposed to do in terms of respecting others, because it's a tragedy. It really is. Not unique to the United States in that sense. I mean, I've seen other things in other countries, but that sense of othering whole groups of people uh, in a way that is really appalling. Really, it's just appalling. The other thing is, one of the ways that this othering happens, is something I'm starting to get clued into now, is that I see politicians who speak, and I realize they're not speaking to me. They're speaking only to white people, okay? And they're, doing a sort of this little white on white dance, and or even on the news, or something like that. I really feel like they don't hear me, or they don't. It's just a funny feeling, and I can't explain it. And I'm like, we're 2021, and someone should be capable to see that broader vision of all of us as Americans. I mean, how many myths have we lived through in our lives about what it is to be an American? Then
Yeah, but
people think that,
no politician does that. Obama didn't do it. Obama threw Black people under the bus when he wasn't elected. But I mean, to the extent that the Democrats play nicer, yeah. But he even admits, he recently in an interview said, well, he couldn't do more because white people would be upset. And I'm like, wait a minute, you got elected because of us. What do you mean you couldn't do more? Were we
well,
your constituents or not?
he could have, right? I mean, well, already we can see with this first set of nominations that have been made for judgeships that Biden has done. He's got a really diverse group that he's put forth as his first set. I don't know them specifically, but I was impressed by the fact that have Muslim American in there, and you had 3 Black women and all that. Yes, he could have done more. Now, I would like to say that I am of the firm belief, everybody, that this phrase I learned when I lived in France, which is that the politician's promises only bind those who believe them. Okay.
Yeah, you say that, Ben, but the fact of the matter is we have not much choice but to hold them responsible for the promises they make. Otherwise, what's the point?
Well, I'm not saying you don't fight with them to make sure that they respect the promises they make. But what I mean is, it's like the nice words are always nice words before the election, right? And I don't believe they're going to do it afterwards until they do it. Okay. And I have to make a choice between the nice words on this side or the nice words on that side. But I'm not having an illusion that they're going to follow through right away. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. But
I think one of the things that it comes through on this, Ben, you mentioned the United States is not unique. Well, the United States is unique on this hate crime thing. Other nations, including Canada, our next door neighbor, have quite a bit of hate crime legislation. And we refuse, in large part because, as you say, we want to draw our laws very carefully and narrowly, and reckon with the free speech aspects or free expression aspects of things as well. But I think the one thing we don't do is these things is do what you were doing there, and that is reckon with our history. Our history is replete with instances of discrimination, not just against Black people, and that's the easiest one because of slavery, but again, as you said, against Asian Americans and others. And I think we need to bring history into the calculus when we consider hate crime legislation, if you will. And that includes legislation directed towards hate speech. We have this very mechanical, very strict scrutiny oriented analysis of any law that attempts to circumscribe certain kinds of speech. But it seems to me that, again, we don't reckon with our history when we do that.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And in my experience, says that the lack of understanding of history among law students and consequently lawyers is phenomenal. I when I first in the 1990s, I started teaching race and racism in American law, and I was going to try to teach it as a critical race theory course. But after the first couple of years, I realized people didn't have enough history to go to critical race theory. That if I went from where they were to critical race theory, it would make no sense to them. They would just be going through the motions of doing some kind of analysis, but they wouldn't have a true understanding of how the law got to where it was and things like that. And so for the next, until I retired, I taught race and racism and the law every year, and it was a history course. And
Mhm.
I walked away from that believing that most people have very little understanding of their own racial history, whether that's Black, Natives, Hispanic, Asian, and no understanding of anyone else.
Yeah.
So
That
I want to cut in for just a sec here. We've got a really good question from one of our viewers, and it relates to the recent hate crime where an Asian woman was badly beaten by someone who was on parole from having killed their mother.
Right.
And people just watched. Nobody
Yep.
did anything. And the New York Police Department commissioner said this is a consequence of the prison system failing. Does deflecting this as a prison problem trivialize the issue that this was in fact a racist hate crime?
well, it's not an either or, which is upsetting. Maybe the prison system failed and he committed a hate crime.
And the prison system may in fact be feeding exactly that kind of division, that kind of racially, ethnically oriented bias and hate and violence.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, there is the thing about the prison systems having typically being essentially segregated by race because of fights that would happen among prisoners, and so basically go to segregate the prisoners as part of that with the various prison gangs thing, which is, when you think about it, kind of a real weird meditation on rehabilitation, that you're rehabilitating people, keeping them separate. If you have a vision of rehabilitation as being part of prison. So, that is, I mean, there's a whole thing system that about what it does to people, and you can think even right now with COVID, right? Prisoners are completely under the control of the state, and then where are they in line getting shot, right? Back of the line, right? And they don't have 6 foot social distancing, all that stuff. It's just a little bit. Then you hear about these places like Angola in Louisiana that sound it looked like something out of slavery when you look at it. It's just so that is part of it. The other thing is those people looking on reminded me of that woman who was beaten in the streets in 1960 in New York and was screaming on the street and nobody uh, said anything or contacted the police. At least that was the myth. It turned out it wasn't exactly that way. But it's that same kind of thing because now we can see with the video of people standing at the door looking out the window and and close the door. It's not my business. Not my business. Well, nothing against New York, but that's the way New York is kind of. It's cold place, and it's unfortunate. It's just really unfortunate that we're not seeing the fear of what this person might have. They might have a gun, something like that. All kind of things can go through a
Well,
person's mind, but
well, the issue for me is not so much what the bystander on the street does. I mean, I would wish bystanders would do more, and I would hope that I'd be in that category. I don't know what I would do because I haven't
right,
been in that situation, but I would hope that I would do something more active even at my old age. But that said, that's not the problem in my mind. The problem is someone committed a crime of hate, and we have people trying to minimize the hate part of it. Oh, yes, we will arrest them for assault. We will arrest them for battery. We will arrest them for murder. We will arrest them for whatever you want to name it, property damage, whatever it is. But we're not going to call it a hate crime. Why? Because they didn't call people names as they were doing it. They didn't have an overt history. There was nothing in their behavior that that overtly seem to target based on race. And so because of that, we, that but for standard, people get to do these hate crimes. I think if we flip the script and said, when you beat up a person of an opposite race, we're going to presume it's a hate crime until you show us otherwise. The burden is on you to prove that race was not a substantial factor in this. Something like that. Now, I have no hope that that will happen, but the fact it's disconcerting that police chiefs, mayors, they all come out distancing the hate part from the crime. And the question is why? Why would they want to distance? What does it cost? Do they lose something by saying it's a hate crime, or it could be a hate crime, or we don't have enough information to know it's a hate crime? Why do they feel a need to defend this person who's committed a crime that it's not not a hate crime?
And we saw that in Atlanta as well, right? First thing the head of the police said was, oh, he said it's not about race, it's about sex addiction. It's that intentional deflection by the law enforcement representative as a spokesperson for law enforcement that is perhaps the most offensive. Okay, coming into our last minute. Last thoughts?
If I can jump in, if I can jump in, just so I'll go from the micro to the macro, I'd like to say the Voting Rights Act law that's been passed in Georgia is a macro hate crime.
Yes.
That one, let's get real. I saw that the governor was trying to tell Black Georgians, oh no, let me explain it to you. It's all right. It's like Black people don't have agency in Georgia to understand what's going on. No, like they don't know that what's going on. They know exactly what's going on. And there's not going to be an explanation that's going to say anything that other than throw rationalization. People understand what's going on. I've seen this game played for so many decades with regards to trying to suppress Black votes and others, but always trying to do it in that way now where it looks neutral so it can pass muster under the kind of standards, the narrow standards you've talked about that are talked about in all of these Supreme Court cases, which, just don't see reality sometimes.
Okay, so we got to wrap it up today. But the other thing that we know that was going on in Atlanta is instead of the two gentlemen with the election commission that stood up against Trump in his attempt to change the voting results, they had a completely different person get up there and basically spout the governor's line.
Yeah.
So even the narrative control has shifted. That we're going to have to wrap up today, but let's pick up on that when we start up again. Thank you, Vernellia, Ben, Jim, and everyone who joined us. 2 weeks, April 15th, 10 a.m. Hawaii time. We'll see you again. ThinkTech Hawaii.